Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Aidan Iaco, the Science Wacko. And today we're going to be discussing the Marburg hemorrhagic fever virus. So, the Marburg virus is truly an elusive virus, not only in its structure and its ability to mask its presence in the body, but also its ability to mask its symptoms to look like symptoms of other more treatable viruses. So today we're going to be discussing the virus, and I want to start out by noting its scientific name, and that's kind of another nod to its elusivity, if that's a word. Who knows? Talking to myself in my room right now, so just kidding. Oh my God. Okay, let's recover. Marburg virus is scientific name is Marburg virus, Marburg or Marburg virus, depending on whether you want to say the genus or the species first. And you may be wondering, why is its name so redundant like that? And the reason is that Marburg virus is part of the family known as Filoviridae. Filoviridae has only two genuses, and that is the Ebola virus and the Marburg virus. And those two genuses respectively only have one species. So Marburg virus genus of this family Filoviridae is Marburg. It's the only virus like it known. It's similar to the Ebola virus, but as you'll see in a little bit, or you maybe not see unless you know the Ebola virus structure, its structure and the proteins that it uses in its defense aren't the same. So it's very odd and elusive in the sense that it's hard to treat because there's not other viruses similar to it. So with that in mind, let's start on our investigation. So we're going to start by noting the biological pathways of Marburg virus. So here's a basic structure of the Marburg virus. Now, one thing to point out is just observational, and it is that it is heterogeneous in nature. A lot of viruses, like your measles, your typhoid, your roseola, those viruses are homogeneous in structure. And that is a lot different than this virus because homogeneous structure is consistent, it's easy to observe, and it's easy to ascertain, to understand, and to make research proposals and to basically just know more about the virus. So when Marburg virus is elusive because its structure is not like any other virus and it's not consistent with other viruses, and it's not consistent even in itself. Essentially, it's just hard to treat and hard to research because of how weird and odd its structure truly is. In terms of structure, it is a filamentous enveloped negative sense single-stranded RNA virus. Basically, what that means is that its genome, or all of its genes that it could possibly express, are enclosed in a caspid that consists of minor nucleoproteins and regular nucleoproteins. And those nucleoproteins are made up of RNA that is negative sense, which means that it makes a complementary strand in order to replicate and in order to create proteins. And this is the same with most of the RNA processes and the protein synthesis that we've already established in Unit 6. But moving on, it's nucleoproteins, or the nucleoproteins, these green ones are the regular ones, and the minor nucleoproteins, those both are the major antigens for this virus because they have strain-specific and group-specific antigenetic determinants, which basically means that these are solely for the Marburg virus, which is another factor in its elusivity. And it also provides structure. So these proteins, the blue and the green proteins that kind of spiral within the caspid, are provide structure. Also, the caspid is connected to the envelope. The envelope is these brown proteins that encompass the nucleoprotein spiral, and they are covered in glycoproteins. Your glycoproteins are your receptors. We learned in Unit 4. Your receptors are responsible for cell-to-cell communication and any necessary processes that will occur within the cell from the outside of the cell. And in your envelope, they have a matrix protein, VP40, and it is very abundant for providing structure, along with the VP24 protein. So as these are just why they're kind of grouped together, which has the ability to internalize the cell nucleus, which is why it's able to get into the body so easily, and be able to wreak havoc on the body easily. Lastly, which is probably the most important part of its structure, is this polymerase protein complex that you see right here. It's at the very end of the strand of nucleoproteins that's within the capsid, and it contains the VP35 protein that facilitates antagonizing antiviral signaling pathways. And this is what, in conjunction with polymerase, masks the presence of this virus within the cell and in the immune system, as we'll see just now. So we have the basic structure, we just went over that. We have our immune system response. We're going to go into a little bit more of the organism pathway and a little bit or further on in this presentation. But basically, the Marburg virus tinkers with the immune system by utterly shutting it down. That VP35 protein complex is really, really, really elusive, and it's selective, and it's difficult because it blocks the human immune system and allows the virus to essentially go unchecked. Now, Erica Ullman Sapphire, a Scripps research scientist, who's been researching the Marburg virus exclusively, says that the immune system is designed to recognize certain hallmarks of a virus infection. When these are sensed, an immediate antiviral defense is launched. However, the Marburg virus masks the evidence of their own infection. By doing so, the virus is able to replicate rapidly and overwhelm the patient's ability to launch an effective defense. That's really, really, really how this virus is so deadly, because your body doesn't even know it's there until it's too late. So it's very difficult to treat, and it's just elusive in that sense as well in its structure. So moving on, we're moving on to the epidemiology of this virus, our next step in our journey. So where did it start, or what is the history of Marburg virus? So Marburg virus was first recognized in 1967 when outbreaks of hemorrhagic fever occurred simultaneously in laboratories in Marburg and Frankfurt. Hemorrhagic fever is a fever that accompanies severe bleeding both internally and externally, and that's a hallmark symptom of this virus, as we'll discuss in a little bit in the presentation. It's basically really bad bleeding accompanying a fever. This also occurred retrospectively in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, which is now Serbia. 31 people became ill, initially laboratory workers, followed by several medical personnel, and family members who had cared for them. 7 deaths were eventually reported. And the first people that were infected had been exposed to imported African green monkeys or their tissues while conducting research in this laboratory in Germany and Serbia. And then one additional case was diagnosed retrospectively in Central Africa, where sporadic cases occur in Central African countries. There have been some notable cases occurring in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Zimbabwe, and Uganda every 5 to 7 years since its initial outbreak. Now, this is the first time that it's been recognized. It may have well been around in the population for much longer. And its survival, and its key to how it survived all these years, is that it's actually not a natural human virus. It has survived through its reservoir host, the African fruit bat, Rosietis aegyptiacus. And fruit bats infected with Marburg virus do not show obvious signs of the illness, which makes it so that people who are bit by these animals don't necessarily know they have the virus. And fruit bats infected with Marburg virus do not show obvious signs, as I said. Primates, including humans, can become infected with Marburg virus and may develop serious disease with high mortality. And it has a really high mortality rate because of its elusivity and connection to other diseases. And it's really hard to pinpoint exactly the diagnosis of Marburg virus, as we'll discuss in a little bit. So moving on to the geography, where is it most common? As aforementioned, the Marburg virus is the most common in Central and East African countries. This Rosietis bat is a sighted cave-dwelling bat widely distributed across Africa. And given its wide distribution, more areas are potentially at risk for outbreaks of Marburg virus than previously suspected. The virus is not known to be native to other continents in the world other than Africa, which is why it really hasn't had a huge breakout in the world, because it's mainly contained in these third world poor African countries where there's little travel between nations and continents. And it typically appears in sporadic outbreaks through Africa through laboratory confirmed cases. And some of the countries, especially Uganda, but also Zimbabwe, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Kenya, Angola, South Africa, countries that are in or around South and Eastern Africa. And the virus is first transmitted from a bat to a human, and then the human then transmits their infection within the communities through either cultural practices, underprotected family care settings, protected healthcare staff, and because it's sporadic, a lot of cases, isolated cases occur as well, but go essentially unrecognized. Although it occurs mostly in Africa, there have been cases that have occurred outside Africa, such as during the 1967 outbreak when they were researching African monkeys because they essentially took the virus from Africa and transplanted it in a European country. There have also been cases where, like in 2008, a Dutch tourist developed Marburg hemorrhagic fever after returning to the Netherlands from Uganda, and subsequently died in the hospital. Because even in Africa, where it's more common, there's not a ton of methods of treating the disease. So when this person went back to the Netherlands, there was essentially no knowledge of what to do in the case of this disease. So he ended up passing away. And of course, both travelers that go to Uganda and have visited a well-known cave park inhabited by bats have also contracted the disease. In terms of where it's most lethal in Eastern and Central African countries, as the treatment is elusive and difficult to carry out even with Western technology. And depending on your location and when you find out you have the disease, it's crucial, because if you get it too late, it's really hard to treat. But if you have it early enough, it is essentially treatable. Fatality rates usually range between 50 to 90%. So that's his epidemiology. So now we're going to be talking about the specific transmission and symptoms of Marburg hemorrhagic fever virus. In terms of transmission, how does it spread? We've said, we kind of aforementioned, which is why we're going to go through this slide a little bit more quickly, because it's first transmitted from animals to humans, and then from humans to others in the population. Bats can transmit the virus through bites and scratches, and it can also be transmitted through the feces, sorry, or residue of bats. It's unknown how this happens. It's really unknown how the virus enters the human body through a scratch. Scientists only know that it happens through bites and scratches, but they don't know molecularly how this virus interacts with the humans at all, actually. And after this initial crossover of a virus from host animal to humans, transmission occurs through the bodily fluids of the infected individual. And this may happen in several ways: direct contact with droplets of bodily fluids from infected persons, or contact with equipment and other objects contaminated with infectious blood or tissues that we're using to treat the person who has the virus. So any bodily fluid, from blood to saliva to really any bacteria containing fluid from the body. It even can be transmitted sexually through seminal fluids. So that is another issue. People with the virus can contract it if they conduct sexual intercourse with the virus. And once it infects somebody, it is highly contagious and must be controlled and contained. It is a level 4 biological virulent, which in the CDC means it's extremely, extremely contagious. And once it makes its mark on somebody, it's very difficult to overcome this virus. And the highest precautions must be made when taking care of this disease in order to prevent the spread of it. People who are diagnosed with the virus must be kept in airlock chambers. People who are treating these people must have hazmats, and other preventative measures are needed to contain this virus. And although it is fast spreading, the mortality rate is so high that there have never been widespread cases because most people die before the outbreak becomes severe. And a little interesting fact is that it's so contagious and it's such a deadly disease that because it was first discovered in Soviet territory during the 1960s, Marburg virus was said by the Soviets to be used as a bioterrorism weapon, similar to how anthrax was in America from Al-Qaeda and how botulism toxin was used during World War I. They wanted to use this virus as bioterrorism against the enemy countries. So that's a little interesting fact. Moving on. Some overarching symptoms. I apologize for some of these pictures that they might be a little bit gruesome for people, but they are visuals of what it can actually do to somebody. So symptoms arrive quickly, or they actually arrive moderately, so they might not come on fast, but once they arrive, they progress rapidly. This virus has an incubation period of 5 to 10 days, and after that, symptom onset is sudden and marked by fever, chills, headache, and myalgia. Myalgia is essentially just muscle pain in the trunk, the back, the arms, really any extremity. Myalgia is just muscle pain. And then around the 5th day after the onset of the symptoms, and these symptoms are associated with any disease from like the flu to a common cold, to really a lot of infectious diseases have these minor symptoms in the beginning. So many people don't even realize that they have Marburg. But around the 5th day after the onset of symptoms, a maculopapular rash, which is a severe rash on the chest, back, and stomach, or the trunk area, may occur. Nausea, vomiting, chest pain, sore throat, abdominal pain, diarrhea might then appear. And still, all of these symptoms are not really associated with any particular virus. And that's what makes Marburg, again, elusive, not only in its structure, but in these symptoms. Because these symptoms are moderate, and if somebody knows that somebody has Marburg virus, and during these primitive stages, people can be treated to live. But a lot of the times, people don't know that they have the virus, and then by the time they find out, it's too late to treat. Because the only symptoms that are associated directly with the virus are extreme symptoms that happen after a while. After those secondary symptoms, they may become increasingly severe and can include jaundice, which is liver damage, and it causes your skin to be a yellow color, like this person in this image right here. And can include inflammation of the pancreas, severe weight loss, delirium, shock, liver failure, massive hemorrhaging, which is why it's called a hemorrhagic fever virus, because there is severe internal bleeding, and that internal bleeding often leads to the extremities. So that blood that's building up inside somebody will end up leaking out of their ears. Any exit that it has, eventually exiting the pores, which is extremely horrible, and it's a horrible way to die. And that just extreme bleeding causes multi-system organ failure, and that's the inevitable cause of death in every Marburg virus case. And because I think I already mentioned this, but because the signs and symptoms of Marburg hemorrhagic fever are similar to those of other infectious diseases like malaria, typhoid fever, clinical diagnosis of the disease is extraordinarily difficult, especially if it's only one single case involved, and it might not be known. Then it really might not, you might not be able to diagnose it right away, and that's essential when you're treating this disease. The only way that one is able to essentially diagnose this disease is if they as if there is a history of going to Africa, to Uganda, and the doctor is able to sort out the possible diseases and come to the conclusion that it is Marburg from just where you were in the environment. That's really the only way to treat this disease, which is truly horrible. And it's really the only way to diagnose diseases from environment and where somebody was. So what organs does it attack? So this is where I'm going into the organism axis, or the organism pathways, the second point on the rubric. Utter danger. The early targets of filioviruses, which include Ebola and Marburg virus respectively, are monocytes, macrophages, and dendritic cells. Now, those are your mechanisms of defense in the body. Those are what protect your body from any sort of disease, whether it be an infection from bacteria or a virus. So it essentially it attacks the dendritic system, or it attacks the dendrite cells, and it basically destroys your body's line of defense. And that VP35 polymerase protein complex goes to work by basically masking that it's actually there and producing antigenic responses that almost mask its presence of being there. So your body and immune system don't really try to protect your body, because your body doesn't even know that it's essentially there. And then through the lymphatic system and the blood system and the circulatory system, it spreads first to your liver, spleen, and then other organs, which is we noticed how there were jaundice, damage to the liver, damage to the pancreas, inflammation of the pancreas. All of these are associated with the virus spreading to those organs first through your blood and your lymphatic system. And then, of course, after that, it spreads to the rest of the body, causing multi-system organ failure and hemorrhaging to occur. So that's how it kind of travels through the body. That's its organism access. So basically, through the contact of somebody absorbed into the bloodstream, travels to the spleen, liver, etc., and that's that. And then it eventually leads to death. The danger factor is very high with this virus. Once infected, the chance of survival is not in one's favor, as it, like I said, is similar to other viruses. And once found, the prognosis is very grim. So, once a proper diagnosis takes place, it's often too late to make any emergency treatment, thus contributing to an unfortunate prognosis. So last but not least, how do we prevent and treat such an abhorrent, horrible disease? So prevention methods are kind of elusive and difficult, because the Marburg virus shows no ethnic or age discrimination whatsoever. I mean, there have been people with documented cases that have been 9, 40, 83, and it's such a powerful virus that every immune system is at risk regardless of its strength. The bottom line is that if you come into contact with an infected individual, you have a high chance of contracting the virus. People who have close contact with African fruit bats, human patients that have Marburg virus, or non-human primates infected with Marburg virus are at risk. So people that are at risk are essentially people treating people that have the virus, or people that are in contact with African fruit bats in that area of Uganda and eastern and southern Africa. Historically, the people at the highest risk include family members, hospital staff who care for patients infected with the disease, and don't use proper barrier nursing techniques, which include wearing a mask, washing your hands, disinfecting any equipment that are used to treat patients. And these people are at risk for exposure to Marburg. Exposure can be higher for travelers visiting these endemic regions in Africa. We started touching on endemic species and evolution. Well, an endemic region is an area where a species only lives. So the species of African fruit bats only are native to that area, and thus only travel to that area. So those people traveling to those endemic regions in Africa um, have a more chance of getting the disease than other people, obviously, because the fruit bats are only there. In terms of how can it be prevented, preventative measures against Marburg virus infection are not well defined, as transmission from wildlife to humans remains an area of ongoing research. However, avoiding fruit bats and sick non-human primates in Central Africa is one way to protect against infection. Really, the only way and the best way to prevent yourself from getting this disease is just not going to that region of Africa altogether. I mean, it sounds horrible, but it's really difficult to to steer clear of infected bats because people don't necessarily know what bats have been affected and which ones have not. If you go to those regions, I mean, I guess don't go into caves where you'll be in contact with the excrement of infected bats, and it's just a really difficult preventative measure to say because it's the only thing you can really do. If you know somebody if you know a patient who is suspected or confirmed to have Marburg, barrier nursing techniques should be used to prevent direct physical contact with the patient. And these precautions include wearing of protective gowns, gloves, masks, and placing the infected individual in strict isolation and sterilizing the proper or using the proper disposal of needles, equipment, and patient excretions, because even the excrement of patients contain the virus. And for those of you who don't know, that's poop and pee. um, and really, treatment. Is there anything that can be done to treat this horrific virus? Treatment is mainly palliative care. If treatment is started early enough, with strong antiviral medication, the virus may be eradicated. However, once the virus has progressed, death is inevitable. During the formative stages of the virus, supportive hospital therapy should be utilized, which includes balancing the patient's fluids and electrolytes, maintaining oxygen status and blood pressure, replacing lost blood and clotting factors, and treatment for any complicating infections. And then, if that's taken care of in the formative stages, which can slow or prevent the progression of Marburg virus, then the patient has a shot at your immune system regaining its health and being able to stop this disease and you being able to survive the disease. And there really isn't other experimental treatments as they're not validated in non-human primates. They've never been tried in humans because the treatment would be so aggressive that it might do more harm than good. And another fun fact is that if you get this disease and survive it, you will have 10 years of antibodies, which is so you basically can't get the virus again for at least 10 years because Marburg virus is very, very slow at mutating because it's really the only species in its genus and the only genus, one of two genuses in a family. So it has a really long cycle for antibodies, so that's a good thing to get from this horrible disease. And that's it. That's the Marburg virus, guys. And we've gone on a journey discussing the biological pathways, the history and geography of the disease. We discussed the transmission and symptoms and prevention and how you can treat this destructive illness. So I want to thank you guys so much, and I truly hope that was helpful. Thank you.